is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. I'll be honest, I haven't stopped thinking about the death of a young child in Hartford, killed by bullets 2 weeks ago in a drive-by shooting. His name was Randall Jones. His aunt, Johanna Vasquez, shared memories of him at a vigil shortly after his death.
He liked to play with the Legos. He used to like slushy. He was a happy baby. It is so hard what happened.
Randall wasn't the only child to die April 10th. Just hours later, about a mile away, a 16-year-old New Britain boy was shot dead too. Jamari Preston's funeral is this afternoon. Today, Where We Live, we wanted to talk about what happens after gun violence. Who is supporting families affected by this trauma? Policymakers talk about disinvestment in programs that help communities disproportionately affected by gun violence. Coming up, we'll talk to State Representative Brandon McGee. First, there are people and community groups that focus on families and young people impacted by violence. Hartford Communities That Care is one of those groups. Joining me now on Zoom is Brother Kelvin Lovejoy. He's an intervention specialist with Hartford Communities That Care. Brother Kelvin, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. And I want to let our listeners know that they can join our conversation too, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. Or you can find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Brother Kelvin, I mentioned you're an intervention specialist with this organization. So what does that mean, especially in relation to what we're talking about today when community members are grieving the death of a child?
The title of intervention specialist is very direct, meaning that, we find ourselves working directly with family members and community residents who are impacted by the violence that happens in our community. We find ourselves at the intersection of working with the hospital when a violent act occurs, and working as a liaison between the hospital, the police department, and the loved ones or the family members themselves. And during a tragic time like the one we experienced just the other week, information is extremely important to the family. And so because of our partnership that we have with the hospital, we're able to go into the hospital and engage with hospital staff, getting the vital information that is needed from the hospital and then getting that to the family members.
We're going to talk more about that partnership that you just described, Brother Kelvin. But I wanted to read a quote that you gave the Hartford Courant after, again, the shooting death of this toddler, Randall. You said, if a white police officer had shot a young black male, there would be marches and mobilization. And you asked, what will we do when we've lost a 3-year-old in our community? Again, that was 2 weeks ago that he died. Describe what you're seeing now in the greater Hartford community when we think about this tragedy.
Yeah, definitely. I remember that quote, and I remember the feeling or the emotion that generated those words. And they are still alive today in the sense that, we have taken violence in our community as a norm, and we don't see enough, not only reaction, but action when these types of tragedies happen. The frontline folks like myself and agencies like Hartford Communities That Care are working overtime, not only to try to prevent these types of acts from happening, but when they do happen, it is a nonstop process to engage our community to make sure that there's healing going on in our community. And so what we see in the city, unfortunately, is this overarching atmosphere of trauma, and that trauma has become pervasive. And what it produces is a sense of apathy. And for the most part, residents believe that there's nothing that can be done. When you lose a 3-year-old, everyone screams, something should be done. But in the aftermath, the question becomes, what should be done?
When you talk about residents, I wanted to break that down further, Brother Kelvin, because obviously there are adults in our communities, but there's also children, young people who see this happening and how that impacts them when we talk about trauma.
Definitely. You know, there's an old saying about canaries in the mind, and it stems from, the industrial age of America, when the miners, who were concerned about toxins being in the mine, and they would send in the innocent canaries, if you will. And if there were hazardous conditions in the mine, then the canary would die. And they knew that that environment was dangerous for human life. Well, today, what we see, unfortunately, in the city of Hartford is that our children are like the canaries in the mine. And we know that something is wrong. We know that something is not right in our community. And the indication is that we're losing our children to violence.
What are you hearing from young people that you talk to, Kelvin? The young people that are also involved in the work at Hartford Communities That Care.
There's a lot. We're in a very strange predicament, a very strange time and environment. Our young people, many of them who are not engaged in school, and so they don't get to see their friends like they used to. The educational paradigm has shifted, and they're in the Zoom world now. And what it has produced is that a lot of our children are not going to school. What was normal for them is no longer normal in terms of trying to walk the path of success. But what has become normalized is this issue of trauma and violence. And so what we're hearing from young people really spans the range of, yes, we need to do something, to there's nothing that we can do at all. That's what we're hearing.
You're hearing on Where We Live, Brother Kelvin Lovejoy. He's an intervention specialist at Hartford Communities That Care. You can join our conversation as we talk about how families and others can be supported after gun violence happens. We're pegging this to this unfortunate story. Just a couple of weeks ago, a 3-year-old child killed in a drive-by, and then just a few hours later, just about a mile away, another child, a 16-year-old, shot dead. And it's something that I just can't get out of my mind as a mother, Brother Kelvin. And that's why I wanted to talk about this today, because as you mentioned, when these incidents happen, people are upset and we talk about it. And then the communities that are most impacted are left to pick up the pieces in this grieving process. And so I wanted to learn more about the partnerships that you have and the resources that you still need to do this work.
Definitely. We're very fortunate, if you will, to have an organization like Hartford Communities That Care, to have organizations that partner with Hartford Communities That Care, like Blue Hills Civic Association and Mothers United Against Violence, the YMCA, and even organizations like Compass Peace Builders, who are out there on the front line, working to find ways really to prevent violence. And, we have trained professionals who are intervention specialists. And the way that we see, the issue of violence is as a health condition. And we are trying to address this as a health condition. And, we look at it the same way you would look at any disease. It not only makes the individual sick, if you will, but it makes the environment sick. It causes you to have to go to the hospital. It can be a cause of death. It impacts us physically as well as mentally, but it is treatable and preventable. But one of the big things that we have to also remember is that it's contagious. And if we don't do something about it here and now, the potential for it to spread across our community is extremely real.
Talk more about this point you brought up about contagion, because in the hours after someone is killed, and you and your teams are activated in the sense of going to the hospital, trying to, help facilitate conversations between family and close friends with the medical providers that are trying to save their life or responding, and the amount of people who also want to respond, and how you need to help balance that and make sure that more of this violence doesn't happen in the hours and days after.
It's a very unique position that we find ourselves in. When the call comes in and our team is mobilized and we go to the hospital, and we find that the hospital was usually on lockdown most times. And this was even before COVID-19, but now it's lockdown as well as the issue of COVID-19. And so you have family members who are concerned, who are worried, who are distraught outside of the hospital. And when the interveners arrive, we fan out, if you will, to find out, who's the next of kin, who's the mother, the father. And at the same time, other interveners go into the hospital and they connect with the charge nurse and the health professionals. And we're trying to find out who this person is and what their condition is. And the process begins there, whereby we gather that information from the hospital and then we connect with the family. But we're also listening. We're listening to see what kind of information may be circulating in terms of not only how things happen or why things happen, but the thought of retaliation is also out there. And so it is our job to engage with family members and loved ones and residents to make sure that there is not a spreading of the violent situation that may have impacted whatever their loved ones are or whoever their loved ones are.
So you and your team on call 24/7, and as the news coverage of around an event subsides, that grief is still there, months, even years later. And so, can you talk about the follow-up that you're doing?
Sure. You spoke about the us being on call 24/7. I would really have to say that Mr. Andrew Woods, who is, the executive director at Hartford Communities That Care, if there were 25 hours in 8 days in a week, he'd be working all of those hours, and we would be right there behind him. And the truth of the matter is, it feels that way sometimes. Our goal is to build that rapport and turn that rapport into a relationship. We understand that family members are dealing with extreme trauma when someone is injured, and that trauma is increased when their loved one, is deceased because of this violence. And so connecting at the hospital is extremely important. And, the training that we have received coming through the Health Alliance for Violence Intervention, or the HAVI training, which is a nationally recognized and certified training that we've received, allows us to use the competencies that we have learned to not only connect with the family, but begin the healing process and help them to put their lives back together, help them to move forward towards that process of healing.
Coming up, we're going to talk more about that healing process with Brother Kelvin Lovejoy, intervention specialist at the nonprofit Hartford Communities That Care. Brother Kelvin, before we head to break, I have to ask, this is important work. You've been doing it for a long time. Personally, how does this work affect you?
Not only is this my quote unquote job or my profession, but it is a mission for those of us who are on the front lines. I can't say that, it doesn't affect us in negative ways. It does, because we're human beings. But every one of those individuals who are injured in the streets of Hartford, Hartford only being 18 square miles, we find that there's a connection somewhere, whether it's with the grandmother or the auntie, the uncle or the brother. Somehow we find ourselves being connected to these individuals. And so I would say that indirectly, it's like having a family member that's injured. It's like having a family member that is lost. And so it impacts us in such a way, to say that we have to do something to stop this. We don't want to see another family member injured.
We'll continue talking after the break. You can join us too. 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. Or you can find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today we're talking about what happens after gun violence. How can communities help victims and their families? You can join us too, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. My guest today is Brother Kelvin Lovejoy. He's an intervention specialist with Hartford Communities That Care. Brother Kelvin, when these incidents happen, again, we hear from people, we hear from policymakers, and I'm curious, when you look at the work that your organization has been doing, where are the gaps? What are the resources that you still need to help families, help communities before this kind of thing happens?
That's a very good question. And I think I would start to answer it this way. And, when we look at, when we look at the condition of our community, and we look at the condition that the families live in, when a violent act occurs, when there is trauma of a violent sort that enters into the lives of these families, we're not just dealing with the current act of violence. When we engage the families, we find that we many a times are dealing with trauma from years past. We're dealing with living conditions, whether it be housing or unemployment or whatever you have at the front door. All of that is compounded on top of whatever the violent situation is. And so when we talk about the gaps, we need resources that will help us not only address the current situation, but resources that will help us deal with the long-term systemic types of trauma that we find when we go behind the front door. So counseling, food insecurities, housing insecurities, job insecurities, you name it, all of that is compounded, and we find this out when we go into the home.
So this idea that when we think about young people dying in gun violence, but also youth with guns, they're not the problem. They're a symptom of all of these other factors you mentioned.
Definitely. Again, from a systemic point, we look at the symptoms of the health problem, and many a times we try to treat the symptom, but that doesn't get to the root cause. And so while an aspirin is appreciated, many a times what's needed is surgery. And we have to go in and deal with some deeply rooted causes of what the problems are, the real problems are.
When we talk about gun violence, especially gun violence that's happening in our cities, do you get tired of the feeling that this is a Hartford problem and Hartford policymakers need to figure this out? When we think about our state as a whole and the fact that we have communities, Brother Kelvin, where substandard housing is not not there, and where substandard education is not there. And we think about all these factors that impact children and the outcomes in their lives.
See, now I have to put on my organizer's hat. So I go from intervener to organizer, and the answer is yes. We understand that there is a broader systemic problem afoot here, and when we look at it, we have to look at it from the grass top to the grassroots in order to truly understand it. Hartford, again, being 18 square miles, and is on the map for many of the inequities, highest seen inequities across the country. Poverty is a major issue. The educational system and its inequalities. Again, housing is another big one. And so, the environment that we live in, if you take a drive, just 15 minutes outside of Hartford, you find a different environment. And what we're saying is that these issues could be addressed, because what happens in Hartford really affects the entire state.
I'm going to put you on the spot, Brother Kelvin, and ask you what you want to hear from our governor.
There is a voice that is building right now, and I'm sure you've heard it over the last year, about racism being one of the first pandemics that we have had to wrestle with. Pardon me. And I know that there is a campaign right now to have the governor address racism as a health problem. And, I would just say, the recognition that what's going on in the city of Hartford is a microcosm of what's going on in many communities like Hartford, your New Havens, your Waterburys, your Bridgeports, and that what we need is the type of resources that can help us to turn the tide, to turn the corner on this issue of violence. Because if we can improve the inequities within the cities, then all the boats can rise. So, what I would like to hear from the governor is that definitely this is a priority for us in the state of Connecticut. And, we're going to sit with those folks who are on the front lines. And what we're going to do is prioritize this and get the resources down to them immediately.
Again, you're hearing Brother Kelvin Lovejoy, an intervention specialist with the nonprofit Hartford Communities That Care, as we talk about the work being done to help victims and families of gun violence. And Brother Kelvin, we did reach Andrew Woods, the executive director of Hartford Community That Cares, earlier. He wasn't able to join today, but he told my producer that last year 220 people were shot in Hartford. That was a 50% increase from the previous year. Mm-hmm. And, we're all looking forward to getting out of this pandemic, and summer is coming. And so when we think about ways that communities can help, that ways that policymakers can help, what short-term things do you want to see?
It's really a call for all hands on deck right now. From, again, policymakers to corporate America, or right here in the state of Connecticut, coming on down to local politicians and city council members, to, the corner store that's in our neighborhood, moving right into the homes of these young people themselves. What we need to see is that we can develop a concerted effort to make the safety of our children a priority, to do all that needs to be done in terms of changing the conditions of our community. We have to see this as a systemic problem and then work together to break down those systemic issues. That's a good start.
I wanted to ask you before we head to break, Brother Kelvin, when we think again about families impacted by violence. Uh, Again, I keep thinking about the mother of Randall Jones. And as we move forward, some of the work that you'll still be doing to help that particular family.
Under the work that we do in terms of assisting victims and their families, it includes crisis intervention. It includes counseling. It may include emergency housing or sheltering, criminal justice advocacy, transportation to and from appointments. So, we are out there to help. We are out there to stand in the gap, if you will, when a family finds themselves in this type of crisis. Many of the things that we have in our brochure, if you will, of services and programs, we go over and beyond that because we understand that trauma does not stay in its own box. And so whatever the trauma expands out to, many a times we find ourselves as well.
And there's a number that for people who want to reach out to your organization. Can you share it with us for Hartford Communities That Care?
Sure. And you caught me off guard there. I was about to give my own number. My goodness.
Oh, you know what? I have it right here. Let me just say it for our listeners. 860-724 1223 to reach
Yes,
Hartford
indeed.
Communities That Care. We're also going to tweet out a link to your website, Hartford Communities That Care. We want you to stick around, Brother Kelvin, if you can, as we bring in one of the policymakers that represents parts of Hartford. That's Representative Brandon McGee. That's coming up right after the break. But I did want to mention that you're doing a lot of work with young people, not just responding to when violence happens, but helping them engage in the issues in their community and helping them expand their voices. And there's a youth virtual summit happening this Saturday.
As a matter of fact, it's our third annual youth summit. We are very fortunate to have young people who have learned how to use their voice to advocate for themselves and their peers. And so Raising Youth Voices will actually be sponsoring this third annual youth summit this coming Saturday.
Wonderful. Again, we'll tweet out a link at Where We Live. That's Brother Kelvin Lovejoy, an intervention specialist with Hartford Communities That Care. Hopefully you can stay with us before we end the show. Before we get to the end of the hour, I just wanted to remind our listeners, you're listening to Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. This conversation about gun violence comes in a week where a former police officer, Derek Chauvin, was convicted of murdering George Floyd. And in a week when other black residents have been shot by police in our country, including a 16-year-old black girl in Ohio. Coming up, we'll talk to State Representative Brandon McGee as well about this moment that we're in. But first, it's the last day of our spring membership campaign. Where We Live brings you conversations with people in our state about stories that are happening in our communities. We want you to know that we rely on your support. And here are two of my colleagues to tell you more.
1-800-584-2788. That's the number to call. But if you don't feel like calling, you don't want to talk to anyone, you could go to WNPR.org/donate to make your pledge of support today. I'm Kat Pastor. I'm here with Tim Rasmussen from Connecticut Public Radio. And today we are here to ask you for your support to keep Connecticut Public and shows like Where We Live going. You're listening to Where We Live. You love Where We Live. You love all the work that Lucy Nalpathanchel and the team of Carmen and Tess has put into the show. And what other show gives you the opportunity to call in and yell at Ned Lamont or compliment him? I mean, whichever way you go, they give you that opportunity. And I can attest, working on the show, I'm the board operator for the show, I can attest just to how much work goes into this show, even the rebranding that we had this year. So much work, so much research goes into the show, so much care and so much time. And the only way that we can really keep that going is with listener support, because we are a listener-funded station. We rely on listeners as opposed to advertisers to fund us. And that also means that we are, everything that we do is in service to our listeners. So if you want to make that pledge of support today to keep Where We Live and all of the other shows on Connecticut Public going, because there's a lot of them. I mean, this year alone, I've been here for a year and 2 months. And this year and 2 months alone, there's already 3 new shows. There's new stuff going on on a Connecticut Public Television. You're being brought content in new ways, new podcasts, new web posts. It's ever expanding. I can promise you as a listener that when you donate to Connecticut Public, your money goes so far and is spent so wisely that it makes it worth it. Think of it as kind of like a streaming service. You're paying for more. When you donate to Connecticut Public, we can do more, and you get to benefit from that by consuming it. So in order to get more, make a pledge of support today. You can call 1-800-584-2788, or you can go to WNPR.org/donate. What's up, Tim?
And that's exactly right, Kat. I mean, if you think about all the stuff that we've done in the middle of this incredible pandemic, the content team that I lead is truly amazing. Not only did we roll up 3 new talk shows on radio, Audacious was the first one, Seasoned was the second one, and then Disrupted. And they're led by wonderful hosts, Kyone Wolf and Marielle Castro and Chef Plum and the great Kalila Brown Dean. And those shows are evocative of the conversations that are going on in our communities right now. Our radio team is also working hand in hand with our television team. And so we started a series called Cutline. And Diane Orson was our first Cutline host back in November, doing mental health in the time of COVID. And upcoming Ray Hartman, his April show is on preserving small businesses in a pandemic. And then our Lucy Napatancho from this great Where We Live show that we all love and tells us a lot more about our communities and brings an enrichment to our lives, is going to be hosting a show about the housing divide in Connecticut and how inequity in housing has been a long-standing problem in Connecticut. And we're going to look at how those things affect people. Where We Live is really about people in Connecticut and how we interact as citizens, as neighbors. And even when we disagree, we can have a conversation. And Lucy brings together lots of different groups, and we look at issues that are old, the issues that are new, and issues that are on the moment. So when you think about the Wednesday's politics focus that the show has undertaken and having people like Ned Lamont on, when you think about the politics focus on Wednesdays, you think about when Ned Lamont's on and the ability to call the governor directly and ask a question. That is truly American democracy at its best.
That is true. And also, if you listen to the Ned Lamont shows, you know that Lucy will not let him get away with anything. She just does not.
Lucy has no problem tackling the big issues in our state.
Oh, no.
and how it affects us. And she does it very nicely.
Yes.
She does it.
Oh, yes, but she will bring it up. She will bring it up. And that's so true about Where We Live. I've lived in Connecticut my entire life, and I really didn't know much about it until I started working on Where We Live. Now I feel like I'm so knowledgeable about it. And I think that it's really important because a lot of the issues that were happening, a lot of people don't even realize. I didn't even realize how widespread some of the issues that I've even experienced are. So it's kind of like a great equalizer as well. So if you'd like to support that, again, go to you can call 1-800-584-2788, or you can go to WNPR.org/donate. And when you go to the website, you can check out all of the great thank you gifts we have for you. You can become a one-time donor or a monthly sustaining donor. It's kind of like a set it and forget it thing. So again, that's 1-800-584-2788 or WNPR.org. And we thank you so much for your support.
This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. We've been talking about gun violence in Hartford that killed 2 children of color this month. This week, a young black girl was killed by police in Columbus, Ohio. Her death came on the same day the nation saw former police officer Derek Chauvin convicted of murdering George Floyd, a black man. Joining us now to talk about this moment that we're in on Zoom, State Representative Brandon McGee. He represents parts of Windsor and Hartford. Representative McGee, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much. And it was a pleasure to hear and listen to Brother Lovejoy speak truth to power. And I really enjoy the incredible work he's doing there.
Before we talk about the Derek Chauvin conviction, I know that you and your colleagues were just as devastated when news came when that 3-year-old was killed in a drive-by shooting. And I wanted to ask you your response and the path you see forward where the Connecticut General Assembly can help communities that are struggling with gun violence.
Yeah, I've said it and I'll say it again. These are very difficult questions to respond to when folks ask Black people, how do you feel? What are your thoughts? It's sort of like we need to hit the repeat button with respect to what it is that we're already doing. And I think we need to continue doing the work to intervene and to support many of our families. But I want to take a step back. And by the way, I'm hurt. This is traumatic. This has been going on for a very long time. Not to forget, on the national level, Black and brown children are being shot almost daily. So there's levels of frustration, anxiety, you name it. But the path forward is to continue doing what many of these organizations have been doing, to work alongside our families and to provide the support needed to really put a stop to gun violence in our communities. But it's bigger than just putting a stop. We have to address poverty, systemic racism, institutionalized racism. And I am so very honored that this state, unfortunately, we're responding to what took place last year during all of the protests, the unrest, as a result of George Floyd's killing. And while that was an unfortunate situation, it served as a catalyst to really push this conversation around racial equity and justice for Black, brown, and Indigenous people here in the state of Connecticut. And I am very honored that this state is taking seriously that talk and really moving the needle forward. But it's bigger than just a laser focus on gun violence. We have to work with communities that have been under-resourced, overlooked for many years.
Earlier, Brother Kelvin talked about the impacts of generational poverty and the impact, the trauma of living in places where you don't feel safe, substandard housing. And I know that you are chair of the housing committee. So when we talk about racial equity, that all comes together in ways that the state can move forward in proposals to help people live in places where they feel safe and are dignified, or where they don't have to worry about rodents and mold and violence on their streets.
Yeah, you bring up a very interesting point, and I make no apologies with what I'm about to say, and I think I've said it on this show once before. In order for the human beings, okay, because oftentimes we talk about these challenges communities like a Hartford or New Haven are faced with as if people aren't human. And for me, I will continue the fight and the clarion call to the state to invest more in communities, once again, that have to deal with blighted properties, deplorable conditions. And so as chair of the legislature's housing committee, alongside my colleagues, I've been laser focused on addressing some of the conditions that many of the people are forced to live in, and they should not have to live in those types of conditions. So there are certain policies, and I'm very happy that Hartford City Council just adopted one of the laws that was passed about 2 years ago, essentially to hold slumlords accountable. And there was a loophole in the system where many of these slumlords from states like New York come in and they buy our properties and they just kind of sit on them. And they make no repairs. They provide no safe living for the tenants because they can. And one of the things that we did to close that loophole was to hold the entity that is financially benefiting from the rent that's being paid by the tenants. in years past, they would just create new LLCs and keep it moving. And so all the fines that the city had been placing on these landlords, they could avoid them. So I'm happy that we're moving the needle a little bit forward with respect to shutting down these very nasty, if you would, landlords who come in and take advantage of the people in cities like Hartford. And this is happening throughout the state. But that bill that was passed 2 years ago is in full effect in the city of Hartford. And I'm very honored that they've been able to pick that ordinance up and do something about it.
You're hearing State Representative Brandon McGee here on Where We Live. As we, this hour, we were talking about gun violence and the fact that we're having this conversation in a week where the nation saw a former police officer convicted of murdering George Floyd, but also on the same day, a 16-year-old girl in Ohio, Ma'Khia Bryant, being shot, killed by police there. Representative McGee, you talked about children of color dying, and this is a problem not just in our community, but nationwide. And when we think about the conviction of Derek Chauvin and the steps that our state and our country need to take, even after this one incident, this one case that saw this resolution, there's more work to be done. You're working, again, on a bill to make racial equity a public health issue, and I wanted you to talk more about that.
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that question. Many cities and towns throughout the state of Connecticut last year, and perhaps even a year before the pandemic, all declared that racism is a public health emergency or crisis. And even across the country, local and state leaders are declaring racism as a public health crisis. We know that a declaration is just the first step in the involvement to advance racial equity and justice. And that must be followed by allocation of resources and strategic action. And so here in the state of Connecticut, I've been so honored to work alongside so many community stakeholders and organizations that are joining in on a fight to move the conversation from declaration to action. And we are in the process, and I'm so very honored, we're in the process of establishing the Commission on Racial Equity and Public Health within the legislature. The goal is to identify two people, an executive director and another position. And, you know, again, given how this important work is and the scope of the intended commission, we know that the money that would be allocated to this commission is a bargain. Not to mention there is influxes of federal dollars coming into the state, many of which I believe are earmarked for healthcare. And with a race and equity top of mind, I shared this on the appropriations call the other day. I can't think of a better use for many of the funds that are coming down. But again, this commission would work alongside legislative leaders, the executive branch, that's the governor and his commissioners, and other community stakeholders to really weigh in on the hiring of Black, Brown, Indigenous people within government, the way that many of our programs and some of the framework by which we are to support many communities throughout the state. For example, housing, which we just finished talking about. We believe that the right to housing is a basic human need, and every person should have that right. The same may apply to our children in the Department of Children and Families. And I could talk on and on the importance of racial equity and public health within our state. But this is the first step in the process. And I'm very, very excited that the legislature on both sides of the aisle are really taking this very seriously.
Well, I look forward to hearing more about that commission's work in the future. I want to thank State Representative Brandon McGee for joining us today. We really appreciate your time, Representative.
Thank you. Thank you. And I really enjoy the campaign. I will be making my donation toward the station. So thank you so much, and keep up the great work.
Well, thank you. And we also want to thank, again, Brother Kelvin Lovejoy for sticking around and hearing this conversation. We hope it's not the last as we talk about not only how communities can help those that are affected by trauma, but just figuring out a way to just help youth raise their voices. And again, there is information on our Twitter about this virtual youth summit that Hartford Communities That Care is hosting this weekend. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today's show produced by Tess Terrible. Representative McGee mentioned our Connecticut Public Radio Fund Drive. It's ending today, but if you have yet to support Where We Live and all the great programming, here's the number to call. Here are two of my colleagues to tell you more.
Hello, it is Kat Pastor and Tim Rasmussen again, not interrupting Where We Live because you just listened to the end of Where We Live. So we are jumping in again to ask you for your pledge of support for Connecticut Public. You can call the number 1-800-584-2788 or go to WMPR.org/donate to check out all of the great thank you gifts that we have for our donors in exchange for their support.
You know, Kat, the first place I ever donated money to an NPR station was WMPR in 1989, and I am looking for the mug that I got. Those pledge gifts are also very nice, but the reality is without the support of our sustaining members, we cannot continue this work, and it's critical that, especially in a pandemic, is our entire staff is working from their homes. The reporters, the producers are going out into the public to tell the stories that are important. As we go through this, we can't do this without membership support. Please donate.
That is really true. We can, and if anybody's listening, if anybody's been listening to Connecticut Public for the past year, I have worked here for a year and 2 months, so that's pretty much my entire tenure here. And it is insane how much this place has expanded, grown, hired new people to cover new beats, to bring you more news, more content, more subject matter. Just in this year and 2 months that I've been here alone, the growth rate has been incredible. And that is why I can promise you as the listener that whenever you donate to Connecticut Public, your money is going very far. It is spent very wisely. And everything that we do is in service to you. Whenever we put out something new, whenever we put out any content in general, you know, the public part of public radio is you. And we rely on your feedback, your criticism. Tell us what you like, what you don't like, and we can adjust to your needs and what you want to listen to. And part of that is because you support us. So again, 1-800-584-2788 or WMPR.org/donate.
And we continue to expand. I mean, your point about only being here during the pandemic is really amazing. We have people who have worked at the organization who we've never met. We've never seen them in person. Yep. You're one of the amazing ones, Kat, because you've been coming in the entire time. And without you and Jean Amartuda and a few others that come in every day, there's no way we would have kept these shows on the air and kept our hosts in safe environments like their living room or their side room in case of Lucy.
Right, in Lucy's side room with the dogs at the door.
Exactly.
Yes, and that has been a fun part of the pandemic, listening to everyone's pets go nuts behind them.
Or getting to see people's kids on Zoom is one of my favorite things. I'm getting to know the colleagues a little bit differently than if you come in the office every day. But at the same time, you know, this work costs money, and being able to keep and buy all the equipment that we had to buy to keep everybody out, to keep everybody's home networks up to the speed, to make sure that we could get desks and chairs in everybody's houses they needed. Whatever they requested, we try to make sure that we can give them. And it's really important that you continue to donate. Please call 1-800-584-2788 or WMPR.org/donate.
And thank you.